So welcome everyone to I think this is our third, our third Lunch and Learn session for the 2019-2020 academic year. The title today is Meta-Analysis, a Beginner's Guide. So obviously you're here because you want to learn about meta-analysis, and our presenters are Dr. Amy Ellman and Dr. Stacy Field. So welcome them, and we'll get started.
Thank you all for coming in the afternoon to have your lunch and learn a little bit more about meta-analysis. And hopefully, even if you don't end up doing one because I scare you, please don't be scared. It'll be okay, just like one step at a time, but it'll be fine. We've run through, student-wise, I've had 2 students do full meta-analyses, so it can happen. But it is a step by step, just take little baby steps. Okay, so do you want to say any more than that? You want to say a little bit about what you've done with meta-analysis?
So I completed one on my own that you and I worked on together. It was a vocabulary, it's not vocabulary, vocabulary is my next one. It was a meta-analysis for English language learners. It was a college feedback study, and it was for university students. It was one that I started looking at. I was looking for interventions for how to teach ELL high schoolers how to write, and it turned into a meta-analysis because it turned out that there was nothing out there. So then I ran a meta instead, and so it's on feedback and looks at all the different effects on how to help university ELL students. And so we'll talk today about how to do coding, how to search for all of those things. So I'm just going to let Amy start, and we'll just tell you from the beginning how to get started, what it looks like, how to create a manual. So we'll start from there and give you the basics.
And I think what's nice, I'll talk about some of the other pieces that people talk about, why meta-analysis is so big right now and why it's important. But for faculty members, it's nice when you come into it, especially new faculty members or anyone that's been here a while. It's nice because you don't have to go out to collect data. I mean, you have to, it's a process. It's probably one of the most labor-intensive types of research that you can do. But you have that data available to you if you're willing to go through the work. And a lot of times you can answer really important questions using meta-analysis. So I think that it's useful to have this in your back pocket. I've published 2 meta-analyses, and you'll see some of the pieces to give you examples as we go through. And I'm working on what I say is my final meta-analysis of my career. I have redone, if any of you are in literacy, the NRP. It has really been what our national policy in reading has been based on since about 2000. So it's taken 10 years now, and we have all of the interventions ever conducted in comprehension, and we have coded now all of those interventions. So this is like it's 10 years of my life now, and of my students' lives, because they learned how to code usually on my project first before they worked on their own. And that I want to have finished by January 1 of this year. So I have the manuscript is going. I still have a few effect sizes to calculate, and I still have some analyses to do. But if I don't meet that January 1, I've got to meet just after that, because it's time for this thing to be in the world. And it'll be nice. It'll probably, I would hope, maybe be published in 2020, which would be the 20-year anniversary of NRP. So I think that would be a good timing anyway. So you guys came, and I know you came for the cute monkey on the advertisement and not really to see me, but we're going to talk about what is meta-analysis, what are the current trends, why should you use it, challenges and benefits, that should be backwards, and how do you do it? So what is meta-analysis? And you guys probably have an idea, but really we take this thing and an effect size for each study, and we're able to calculate that effect size across different kinds of measures. And it gives us that common metric, and then we combine all of those it's really a collection of those independent studies to determine an overall treatment effect, but then we can also ask questions about for whom and under what conditions whatever you're studying is effective. And I use, all of my work is on intervention or instructional work, at least at this point. There are other meta-analyses that can be done, but really my driving question and why I do my research is because I want to know what works, for whom and under what conditions, so that we can get kids what they need. And so this is a way to really look broadly at an area and answer these questions. And you'll see later, though, it also helps us to know in research what's not been done yet. So once I have my matrices done, and I'll show you some of those, I can see clearly. We don't know anything, for instance, about group size in this literature because no one's reporting it, no one is really looking at that. So it helps in multiple ways in knowing what works for kids, but then in also knowing where the research needs to go next. So we know that science really isn't one single study. It's not going to prove anything, not that we'd ever prove anything, but it really doesn't give us the answers we're looking for. Well, we need a convergence of evidence to tell us that, and we need it across methods, sample, and settings. And that's what meta-analysis allows us to ask these questions across many different studies, samples, and settings and other conditions. So meta-analysis really is now considered like the gold standard for policy making. So really, when policymakers, well, actually, when people are preparing information for policymakers, they're taking meta-analyses and they're breaking that down and they're making decisions based on those meta-analyses because it really allows you, I mean, if you guys, if you've done any kind of literature review, finding a meta-analysis in what you're studying can be so useful because you're like, they've done all the work, I can really see, what this means because I'm not looking at all these individual studies, right? I will say, though, that I've decided to, as I'm writing the intro, I decided to go back and find all the meta-analyses also done in comprehension so that I can know what's been done before, and there are 56 since 1984. And so that may become a whole paper in and of itself. But now I have a clear picture of how they ran theirs and how mine is the same or different. And that's actually above this, we have what we call meta-analyses being done now, where the collections of that's John Hattie's work, is all about taking all the metas that have been done in an area and just making it into one number. There are problems with that, but he's gotten a lot of good press for it. But we know that we're really lost in this sea of information now. These are the number of publications about meta-analyses over time. You can see it's drastically, this is 2009 here. We see a huge number, and why is that? Because we have the information coming at us now. We have more that's, I think, in 2 days or something, information that's collected than, would have been in hundreds of years before. In 2 days, we're collecting and reporting on that information in the world now. So given that rate, we can't keep up with it. There's no way to know. Like when you say, well, what are the evidence-based strategies in teaching vocabulary? There are a lot of studies out there that you'd have to go through and sift through, and there's more stuff coming in every day. So having a meta that helps to compile that and discuss that in a systematic way, I think is useful. I always like to start my presentations with teachers when I go out because I think they need to understand effectiveness, what is effective when they're looking at research. And so I always talk about meta-analyses or effect size in this way. So in education, and this is not the case in other fields like medicine, but in education, a small effect, for me, that means I'm probably dancing in my office because I can probably publish that study, right? If I get a moderate effect in a study, that means I'm dancing in the street. People need to know about this because it could really help kids. Now, there are some qualifiers, but in general, this could help a lot of kids. And if it's large, I'm dancing on the moon. This is a really important finding that people need to know about. I also tell my students, Stacy, if it's above 0.8 or above 1, what should you do if you're reading a study and coding it?
It's above 0.1. You need to contextualize.
0.8 or above, or even a 1.
I don't know. You always need to contextualize within the literature where you are.
You do have to contextualize it. And actually in your area and with young children, you might get a 1.0, but that's very rare. So you should always really critically analyze that study to make sure that that really was a study in which they got above a 1, because it is suspect, because it's very hard to get something above a 0.8 usually, at least on FAR transfer measures. So this is, do you guys know John Hattie's work? So you've probably heard about visible learning. There's a great 2009 book, and the reason I like this is it's got a bunch of the meta-analyses in each of these areas. So each of these pieces here, these, what are these, educational programs or methods have been, he compiled all the meta-analyses done, and this is really an average of those. So, and I often will set this up without the data in it, and then I'll have teachers sit in groups and say, which one of these are evidence-based? Do you think it has a high effect, a medium effect, or a low effect? And then I show them what's actually the case, and they're always, and then we talk about, well, what were the things you thought should have been that weren't? What are some of these things that you don't know about, but probably should know about? So that's the way I usually start, and they go, oh. Here, this is Hattie believes that 0.4 is where we should evaluate these, anything above a 0.4. But there are others who recommend a 0.1 on standardized measures of 0.1. So there is disagreement in the field about what is important and useful. Hattie's been the one that's been most, he's been the loudest. So I think that this one has been talked about the most, but it really depends on that dependent measure that you're talking about, on what measures. Does anything surprise you about the list of things that are effective and not effective?
That student expectations about being 1.44 after you just said maybe be a little suspect of that. And then, of course, how do you define any of the, what do those really look like?
Right, that is exactly. Imagine a meta-analysis first squashes down studies that have operationalized these constructs differently. Now a mega-meta is actually taking some crazy stuff. And that's where we disagree a lot with Hattie actually in our group, because when you look, when you dig, you're like, I don't know if I would call that student expectations. But that it is this high is interesting. So this is actually what spurred me to start adding mindset instruction to our intervention work, because knowing that what students believe that they can and can't do matters. And so we started systematically adding those pieces to a lot of our interventions. Katie Schroet was one that added to hers. Natalie Griffin has added a growth mindset to see what is the impact of adding that. And that was because of looking at this. This is really important.
So I think it's been interesting too with his work that when you look at any given meta-analysis, to look at the dates that those things were published, to get a sense of how old is this data, because some of it's very, very, very dated.
Yes, yes. Now in this study that we're currently doing, we've taken everything. So, we set it from 1918 to 2018 is our end date. And so 100 years, of course, we don't see anything starting to happen until the 1950s. And then it ramps up, in the 60s and 70s where we start to see work. But a lot of it is older. And so one of the things that we actually moderate on or check is year. Does year matter? Do we see a difference now than then? So it is one of the things, if we take all of it, we can systematically look at, do more recent studies get better or worse effects than older studies? So you could look at that very question through meta-analysis.
And I also talk to my students about if you're seeing these things in something like a mega-meta, let's consider what they were talking about, and does it matter to me? So if I'm a middle school teacher, if I'm looking at research, if I'm a middle school teacher, is this effective for my students? Like Amy said, who is it effective for? So if I'm really digging into the research, even if I'm just looking at a meta, is this appropriate for my students, right? So let's look at this wisely. Is it for my students? Because I don't want to give phonics training for a middle school that may not be as effective as something that's more effective. I need just to be wise about what I'm reading and who it's effective for and what the research is saying. So I really need to be wise and thoughtful about what I'm reading and who it's effective for. and how it's been
And
put
we
together.
can ask those questions as well. And what's been done previously, like what did meta-analysis replace? And it really replaced, the synthesizing of research. So we have the traditional review, which is typically qualitative, and you really look for those themes across those reports. But it's non-systematic, it lacks reliability, and you have this inability to really replicate findings. It's really whoever wrote the piece a lot of times. I wouldn't, if we wrote them separately, we'd probably come up with very different pieces looking at the literature. For quantitative pieces, using a systematic review piece, right, we could systematically at least make these decisions, and we could code things. But what's typically done is a vote counting method. So either the study showed if we're talking about maybe randomized controlled trials or quantitative work where we have statistical significance, really we have this vote counting where if it wasn't significant, okay, you just say it wasn't effective, right? And if it was significant, then you say it was. You count them. There were 4 that were and 4 that weren't. However, that doesn't take into account, the problem with this is that sample size drives significance, right? So what happens in education? Are the studies usually large or small? They're usually small. So we say that they didn't have an effect, yet when you look at the effect size, it could be very large. So there were a lot of times in the literature that when I was doing the vocabulary piece where people had cited work of saying this isn't an effective procedure, and yet when I calculated the effect size, it was 0.78, okay? Because when I look back at their sample size, they had 10 students. So no wonder they didn't get statistical significance, but they probably had a procedure that may have been helpful for kids. So why use it? We talked a little bit about this, but single studies are not enough to tell us, to answer our questions. It really gives the structure to the lit review. So all of my students are now trained when they do their first lit review in a systematic lit review so that there's structure there, and it helps them to understand the literature better because they're coding and looking at things both from a broad perspective and then a detailed perspective. They understand what's important in this research, then they can step out and look, what are the patterns that I see about this information that I've coded? So it has been very helpful in developing PhD students to really understand the literature well, but it gives them structure to write this review. And it's also helpful for introductions of topics or justifications for grant proposals.
Sorry, Amy. So you didn't talk about mixed method, right? So because you talk about like qualitative and quantitative, what about mixed methods?
In this case, so there are what we call best evidence synthesis, where you can take other studies or single case studies. They just have to be analyzed separately and in a different way, but they can be done together. So you include all of the studies that no matter what the design is, and then you write the quantitative piece as you see here, and you code the other pieces similarly, though they're going to be a little bit different. You could do it, but that is, because it's qualitative in nature, is also going to end up being a qualitative part of your paper to either support or not support what you're seeing from the quantitative information. It's rarely done because people typically, the space, this is one of the problems with even publishing a meta-analysis is they're big. So they run 50 to 75 pages typically, and they can be bigger than that even. And a lot of journals then won't publish them. They will sometimes make an exception though for meta-analysis because it gets a lot. If you want to get pieces out that have a lot of citations, this is the way to do that. And so they will take them for that reason, but not all of them. So you have to watch that page limit. But when you start adding those qualitative elements in as well, it's a really, really big project and a big paper. Plus you need to have skills in qualitative and quantitative research, or you have to have a team that can do that. So here are some of the benefits, and we have talked about those. I really like that it handles a large number of studies. So for my students, when they start coding all those individual studies, I can't keep even 4 studies in my head anymore. I've gotten older. I can't keep like, okay, what was the sample in that one? What was, all of the information kind of, and after, certainly when you have maybe 10 studies, or you're doing a chapter 2, a lit review of your dissertation, and you've got to keep track of all the literature, this is a great systematic way to keep track of that information. Challenges? takes a lot of effort. You've got to be a person that doesn't mind hard work. Like, and you're okay with every day, just going to do a little bit more. But if you like structure, the steps are all there laid out for you. So you just have to, little steps the whole way there. Not all the studies give you all the information you need to answer the questions you want. I actually started the comprehension meta-analysis because I was asked all the time by researchers, Amy, what measure should I'm doing this comprehension study, what measure should I use? And these were seasoned people that I would be brought in, and that would be the question I'm always at the table to answer. And I'm like, I think, because we know that certain measures are more sensitive to interventions than other measures. But I said, I don't know which ones. So I actually started the meta-analysis looking for that information. Can we find out if you're designing a vocabulary instruction to impact comprehension, which measure really picks that up, which is sensitive to change on that outcome, and didn't have enough in each category to be able to do it. So the whole reason that, I'm also redoing the NRP, so I can't really say a whole lot. But my personal reason was to figure out which measure should I tell people to use when they ask me this question. And I'm not going to be able to answer that question, unfortunately, with this data that I currently have. Again, that doesn't capture those qualitative elements. What I find is that once the data tells me, for instance, one of our codes is coming up repeatedly. I think we may have lost it now that we've added our 2014 to 18 data. But it's showing that tasks that require deep thinking and something beyond just answering questions seem to matter in comprehension. Which makes sense. I like this outcome. I can talk about it. But then I pulled all the studies which had high values coded for that, so that I could distinguish what does that actually look like and mean? What does depth of instruction or depth of task actually mean? So that's where the qualitative piece comes in, but it's after I already have my quantitative data to tell me to go look at that. So that gives you a little bit of qualitative, but not a whole lot. You have a lot of studies that just aren't that good. So do you include them or not include them? And there's a whole literature on whether to include them or not. I was trained that you include everything, and then you code for quality and check that quality. Because I don't know. I've seen dissertations that are way better than peer-published research. So I won't make that. I'm not going to make that. If the quality is not associated with the effect size, well, then why would I leave it out? It's evidence, and how am I to say what matters and what doesn't matter? Let the data tell me that. But that's a personal choice. There are others who say, no, I will only take, and Slavin is one with the best evidence synthesis, only the best literature, only quality pieces. And I think that limits you because you can't answer other questions maybe because you eliminated that data. When can you do it? Usually when the idea, you're looking at an empirical question. You're going to have mostly quantitative rather than qualitative for a true just meta-analysis. If you do a best evidence synthesis, you can bring that qualitative piece in. You need to be evaluating the same constructs or relationships and be able to give a rationale for why you believe that these fall. Hattie doesn't do any of that in his books. And you're like, these do not look like they fall under the same construct. But you need to, needs to be in the same realm. And you need to be able to calculate that effect sizes, or calculate the effect size from a paper. So there are 8 major steps in conducting a meta-analysis. First, specify the problems and your questions. Second, you want to establish study inclusion and exclusion criteria. You got to go get those studies, which is that's what takes most of the time. Okay, so that and the coding are probably the most labor-intensive pieces of a meta-analysis. You need to develop the coding protocol, and then you need to code the reports. Determine and compute the appropriate effect size or effect sizes for your data. Analyze the data. Interpret that evidence within the literature, but also assess for something we call publication bias, which we'll talk about, which is a big limitation or can be in meta-analysis. And then you need to report the results. So see, just 8 steps. 8 steps. And certainly, there's a reason why people didn't redo the NRP, the the comprehension section. There's a reason that it took them 2 years with federal funding, a lot of money. Usually people are funded well to do this work because it requires a lot of people, or it doesn't have to, but that's a huge project. For the ones that you'd be working on, you could do, as long as you have a partner, you'd be fine. You could get one done in a year, 2 years, typically, I think would be a turnaround time, if you're working steadily on it. So specify that problem. Look for other reviews in the area. Are there any metas that have been done? How did they ask those questions? Would you ask it differently? Would your inclusion-exclusion criteria be different? Does it need to be updated? Does that meta-analysis need to be updated? Okay, but before we go any further, we got to talk about, this is probably, if you are not a data management person, and I don't know that this is my forte, but I have made it, I just have to do it, right? And now I've learned over time how to do it. But you have to be willing to keep up with a lot of things and a lot of data. So I suggest that you put together a manual from day one. It sounds crazy and it seems like a lot more work to put together that manual. But every time you want to go back to what you said a code is, you need the manual to do it, or you're just going to end up over and over. You're going to make a lot more work for yourself if you don't have at least a short manual. You need to have the purpose and scope of what you're doing. That will help you when you go to write it up, because it's already done, right? You've already stated what your purpose is. Your inclusion criteria should be clearly listed there, and your exclusion criteria. And your moderator coding variables. What are each of the things that you care about? And we'll talk about what that might look like in a little bit. You'll have an article database. Okay, this is and I'll tell you, this is where I messed up at first. I probably had 5 copies of the same, I'd find it and then I'd put it aside and find it again, and I'd find 5 copies of the same article. And so you want to be able to touch things once. That's really the key here, twice at the most, right? And so I would definitely have this article database in play. And that means if you had to pull it and print it, you need to code it for inclusion criteria. Does it really meet your criteria or not? And then you need to make a record of that. So you know which ones you've looked at and which ones you haven't. And when you go find more articles, you need to look at your database to make sure, do I already have this? And if I don't, and back in the day when I didn't have the first, my vocabulary meta-analysis, we had hard copies of everything. Everything was hard copy. And I would have notes on file cabinet, in file, on microwave. So you knew where to go. So
at my friend Summer's house, we have stacks and stacks of Amy's meta.
Yeah, so he's like, where you knew where that paper was kept. So you need that article database. You need somewhere to store your article PDFs now, which is really nice these days. When I first started this thing, I'm getting microfiche out. It was crazy. It's much easier now in some ways. And then you need your main database, which is this database. So this is typically when you do a research project, you got one database. No. You've got a bunch of places. We have found Google to be very helpful for this. It keeps all of our files. We all can interact with them. That has been useful.
Can you give an example? That's where I'm going. Go to the next slide. The inclusion-exclusion criteria, how you would go.
So number 2, we're going to establish our study inclusion and exclusion criteria. What's our topic of interest? What are the publication years? And you have to give a rationale for everything when you write a meta-analysis for each of these decisions that you've made. So design, your participants, and then what are your outcomes? And that will help you to know, and you add that criteria to your manual. So when you are coding it, and then I give it to Stacy, say, let's see if you pick the same studies. And she looks at those studies and says, yeah, they're all included based on this criteria. Then we have inter-rater reliability that we all both agree that these are included and these are excluded.
And the manual is an evolving document, because as we code and recode and change the criteria, we may do 5 or 10 studies as we get into this, and then we decide, we should have added one more thing. We should be looking for one, because we're seeing the same studies.
Or we're coding it differently.
Right.
So we've got to check for that and say, why are we coding this differently? This code needs to be updated and changed. And then, of course, if you've already done work here, you go back and change all of them. So it is an iterative process. The first time through is like messy. And even the last time through, my poor people now are still like, I'm like, oh, you have no idea. This is like a breeze. And they're like, but I don't know exactly. And I'm like,
What
no.
did they mean by this? Because
Yeah.
we thought it
Yeah.
was very
And
clear.
Once you train some, yeah, you think it's really clear, and then you have a new person come on, and they're like, I don't see that. And you're like, okay, let's update to make it very specific. So over time, these things, they change. So if you stay in the same area, because I've stayed in comprehension. So the first one was on vocabulary instruction. The second one was on inference instruction. This third one is on all comp instruction. So I've stayed in that. So a lot of the pieces of the manual have stayed the same and can be adapted. And you are all welcome to any of my materials. So you can see the manual, the coding sheets, everything you can have access to, so that you could create your own.
Sorry, Amy. What about the publication year? So let's say, your exclusion is up to like 2015, and then, you're still working on it, and then 2017, this really important article came out. Do you include, exclude? So if you include, that means you've got to take 2015 to 2017,
Correct.
all
That
the
is
paper.
correct. That is correct. And that's what's killed us. So in 2014, I presented at conferences. In 2015, all of the data, because I was ready to go, right? Well, I didn't publish. I didn't get it done. So guess what? Rolls around 2018, I'm like, I have to update 2014 to 18. So it's like starting another meta-analysis. Like we had to start from day one and move forward. So that's why it's taken so long to get this done. But that's why I'm like, it is going out the door, because I'm not updating this thing ever again.
So if you decide on a year, even if a good article comes out, you just
Nope, 2018 was the stop. Now, if another meta-analysis comes out, I'm in trouble, especially if it's asking the same questions I'm asking, right?
well, you
Because
gotta
they're
get
going
on.
to beat me.
Tip
There are
us.
yes,
Go.
yes. So there were two labs when I published the vocabulary meta-analysis. There was another lab working on the same exact question. We beat them on publication, and it mattered. They didn't make it. That piece has not been published. And actually, Rick Wagner, he's at the Florida State, and he was on that paper with one of the individuals, and a student of his, and he uses mine when he's citing something. So I think that's so funny, but he's always so nice when he'll email me, hey, I cited your paper, but they were working on the same question. And they saw us present it at a conference, and they were like, oh, so it was a competition then to get that out the door. This one's so big, there's only one person that I think would do this, and they did do 4 through 12. They looked at oral language, 4 through 12, so it's similar, but different enough that I think I'm okay, but I do need to get on it. That's just an example of like how that's written up there, like the inclusion criteria, that's part of it. We go on to say which intervention, student measurement, design characteristics were included or excluded. So this is the part that's going to take you forever. My first one took 2.5 years. Like I had done the meta-analysis in my meta-analysis class, and but after that, we still had to search for to make sure we had everything. Like you had to do it for class, right? But it was the searching that took forever, and it does. It just takes a long time. I've gotten better. The inference piece was probably done in 6 to 9 months, getting the searches done. So better on that one. But 10 years on the comp, so I can't say, I don't know. So you need to look in electronic databases, search reference lists of previous, okay, this is this bibliographic search. Hand search journals, so pick all the journals where you're seeing stuff come up and then go through every single article and read the title. If the title looks like it could be concluded, you go to your abstract. As soon as we hit the abstract, then it goes into our article database. So we know that we've covered it. We know it's there. And you also have to report that, because this is part of the methods of meta-analysis. You have to report how many were excluded in what way. And so that takes a lot of time in and of itself. So you want to keep, these records have to be kept they have to be really organized. You need to
let me ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So every article you touch, either electronically or physically, goes into the database, and whether, if you excluded it, why, if you went to the abstract, exactly, wow.
So you have to have a really detailed person on the front end, because at the end, then you're going to have a chart that says we touched 25,000, we excluded 4. That's why you have that exclusion criteria, because then we read these abstracts, then we excluded these because, so you have to keep a detailed map that you can explain why and
So
where
someone
you
could
whittled down.
replicate that.
Yes.
They could follow your rules and they could replicate what you got or something close to that.
Yes, a very clean and neat, because I think mine says I have 25,186, and you can trail it down to the 21 that I have in my meta.
Out of 25,000.
Yeah, so I find it to be, that's about the ratio. Because I think we're at, I don't even know what we have for the big meta. 1,600, no, that's for numbers that we've touched. Because we have over 200 studies. That's a good question, but it's 30,000 hits, I think, electronic hits. And then we went through 10 to 15 hand journaled, like went through all of them. We went by hand through those. But you also have to contact experts in your area. I find what's helpful is Scopus. Like if you go to Scopus and you find researchers, the top 100 researchers in that area, you can click their file and then it shows you everything they've done. So you can go through every single one of those and find a ton. I found a ton of stuff that we did not see in the electronic searches, and I don't know why, because they all work on Orchid ID and these websites. They all work the same. But I'll tell you, different systems will give you different things. Supposedly the EBSCO host here is the same as the one at Vanderbilt. They are not. So we'll get 10 times more at Vanderbilt than I do here. So I don't know why. I just know that you have to be extremely thorough and every which way you can. And how do you know when to end? When you stop finding stuff. When it's repeated over and over and over again, you're like, okay, I'm not seeing anything different coming through. You wanted, we already talked about that. Reference lists of each one. I think that's what I talked about.
So
there.
every
Those
article,
are previous reviews.
right? Every article you check, every article that you get, then you check the reference list of each one of those, and then begin to check from there. So it takes a long time.
And then you want to consider those near misses, things that people in the field talk a lot about, and they're like, why wasn't my study in there? Well, you need to make sure that you make some, studies were excluded for these reasons, and here are examples of the ones that were excluded. So then they were like, okay, you told me exactly why I've been excluded from this set. This is what I tell students, when you're working on a meta-analysis, when you're working on a class project, you're really going to do narrow and specific search terms, but when you're working in a meta-analysis, your search terms are going to be way broader. You're just going to be a lot more you have to sift through. And I tell them to watch TV, like turn on Netflix, and just go through while they're, because it's mindless once you know what you're looking for. Now you do need to do it without Netflix until you are used to looking at these. But after a while, you'll be like, no, it doesn't fit, until you get to the abstract, and then you got to put that in your article database. But like you'll go through a lot of things, and there's no reason. And I like to do it at long settings, because why? If I wait till tomorrow, that database is different. Now you can freeze it and go through it. So this is like, that's why I don't care for the electronic searches and the, how replicable is it? Because I'm like, day to day, those change. But I like to sit through and kind of do it as much as I can in these large chunks, but watch some, dumb TV that you don't have to think a lot about. And you won't let yourself watch it, unless you're doing something. This is one of those.
But every one you reject still has to be recorded?
Only if I go to the actual article to pull that abstract. If I go to the actual article, that's when I will decide that. Like, actually, if I go to the article, I'll read the abstract. And so I know I had 33,000 hits. Let's say I've done the search in this, search. I put 33,000 over here, and I say, okay, I'm going to start going through all of these 33. So many of them are just junk. Like, they don't fit. They're not junk. They don't fit your criteria, right? So you're just like, gone. So you don't have to really keep track of those, because no one's ever going to go for that article again and pick it up and look at it. And that's what you want to avoid is, would you look at this thing again and go through it? And you want to keep track. But it's once I download a PDF, because I'm still not sure from the abstract, that's when I put it in and they're really, aren't 10% maybe of the studies you're looking at, you're doing that with.
So are you, like if you're doing, are you seeing some of the same things and you're hopefully both rejecting? I'm wondering, because if it's me, I'm like, wait, I've seen this before. You know, are
And
you
that's
pulling
why it's
them?
on the Google Drive and you're keeping track so that you can always look and you're just putting in the find for that author. You're putting it in, you're like, oh, they already got this one. I don't need to worry about it. It's being taken care of. It's being brought to the group. So yeah, that's how we have handled that. That's been helpful, where we can each access the Google Drive. But yes.
Mine was probably 100 articles that I really pulled. And we pulled, I don't know, how many for yours? A couple of hundred. That we
600?
didn't had to,
I think we've pulled
we had to go
at least,
through
it's 600 to 1,000, I think, that we've pulled.
and then decided. And then you have to keep up with, and I have mine in a spreadsheet.
But mind you, that's a huge one. More typical is the 20 to 30 range, which is not going to take as long and is very, very doable. So that's where I think most metas are going to fall.
So in mine, I just had a document. Once I pulled it, I listed all the authors, names, dates.
Make sure you list all the authors, because that was one of my other mistakes. I would put the first author, well, you know how many people do multiple? It's like, which one is that? Which Bose and Anders is that?
I
There
went
are
ahead
four,
and did the citation, so then I could just pull the citation and go. And then I had it, so I would highlight it if it was red. So I just had several columns, the authors, the name, the full citation. And then if it was rejected, then I would put in there, I'd put a red and why, justified based on my exclusion criteria. So then when I had to, because I was fortunate I'd worked with Amy, knowing where I was going in the process, then I just knew. And when I had to make that chart, I knew exactly how many I could go down and count and what my reasons were why I rejected.
Okay, what's this? There are different systems. EndNote, any of the bibliographic, what's the big one though? The one that we're using now in the lab? Nope. Okay, I'll think of it, but that has been, that will keep track of all of your references. And so when you go to do your reference page, it's already set up, but it will also help you keep track of which ones you've absolutely included. So that's nice as well. And there are a number of different bibliotech. There's a bunch of programs you can use for that, but this is one that everyone is moving towards.
They make me nervous,
It's
so I'm
what
still
we're
old
using it.
school.
Yeah. No, this is
Tools?
good. What's
Noodle tools?
no?
No.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
It keeps track of everything.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll
And
have
you
to
can
look at
add
that
note
one.
cards and everything.
I'll have to look at it. Noodle tools. All right, good. Write that down. These are one of the resources for yours, the What Works Clearinghouse. This is Handbook 4.1. And this is a table where they just give an idea. These are all the different terms that can be used for intervention or instruction. So when you start running these searches, you're like, oh, I need to broaden, all of these things. Or if you want to be specific, it can get crazy. Different outcomes that can be used. The samples that you're looking for can be called different things, grade 10 versus 10th grade. You got to make sure that the machine's going to pick those up if that's part of your inclusion and exclusion criteria search terms. These are the different electronic databases that can be searched. Eric, Scopus, like I said, I typically do backwards searches in this one, where you click on the reference and then it'll take you to all the references for that piece. So you can do this web kind of searching, but I really like it for, that list of researchers and then going through all of their work. Because Sharon Vaughn, we went and could get every one of those PAC studies that we've been coding, for instance. PsycInfo, ProQuest, Google Scholar. People, I know they do not like Google. I use Google Scholar quite a bit. It's not great because it will give you so many hits that you cannot possibly go through them all, but I still find it helpful to just run searches. I'll do it for decades or for a few years just to see if what I'm getting there is everything, because it will have a lot more typically than the other stuff. Here are collections of electronic websites or databases that you can find studies that have been done, that they collect these under different topics. Florida Center for Reading Research, for instance. And so I think that's useful information as well. Okay, so what do you got to do? So this is what you ultimately have to come up with. And this Prisma is like the reporting guidelines now that are used in meta-analysis. And this is, they are recommending that you use this flowchart. This will be the first time I'll actually put one together because when I did it before, no one was using Prisma guidelines and now everyone's using it. And they expect this. So it's really telling you the number of records identified through database searching. So that's where your 33,000 goes. The number of additional records identified through other sources, so your hand searches, those types of things are going to go here. How many duplicates, because there are always duplicates from different sources. The number of records screened, the number excluded, full text reads, full number of full text articles excluded with reasons. Okay, the number of studies included in the actual, in the qualitative portion, if you have that, and then what are the quantitative numbers? So that's the end of the day. How did you get there, and could somebody replicate what you're doing? And that's the biggest part of meta-analysis. Can it make it so transparent that someone could replicate what you have done? So that's an example of the beginning of our search procedures, what we write up in our article. And I will say that other than not following all the Prisma guidelines, which I'll follow in the next one, the articles do, a lot of my students have just used them as a template for how you go about this. So they're like, okay, here's the step. So if you'd like those articles for that reason, please, I will share, anything I have, I will share with you to make the process easier. Here's what our article database looks like. This is just like a simple version of that. We actually have it color-coded for which ones are included, which ones are excluded, and which ones we're still deciding on. So this we'll bring to the group. Often ones we're like, does it fit or doesn't it fit? And what parts of it fit is often something we talk about. So here's the APA citation. Was it included? The reason for that? Notes. You could have, if it's kept somewhere other than on the Google Drive, I guess you could have. That's what we used to have in there. And then who actually touched that? Next, you have to develop that coding protocol. And this can be a fun part, actually, because it's like this is where you're getting to what are the things you care about. For instance, in teaching, in comprehension, what do I think matters in the classroom? And can I capture that from the studies that have been done? What size should the group be? What should the text look like? What kinds of activities should they be doing? What are the specific interventions that work? I think that for me, I like this part probably the most out of what we do. And at the end of the day, you are going to be assessing that intercoder agreement. So you've got to train others, and that's where the manual is so helpful. Then you go train, and you train on 10 studies, and then you come back and talk about it. And then you go back and you do another 10 studies, and you see where that agreement is until everybody's up, knows exactly how to do this. Then you take off and do the rest of your sample of studies. And then we have examples of the coding manual form I can show you guys if you're interested.
So here's some options of some coding forms. This is a short form.
Look at the short
these are
form because
some
that's where I
longer
expect
forms.
most people would start this process. The other form is my form based on my manual, and that's only because my professor was Mark Lipsey, who's written a book on meta-analysis, and he's like, I had his coding manual to start with, and then I added all the comprehension stuff on top of that, right? So it's like that's been built from people who do this, they're policy people, this is what they do. So I would look at the short coding form because that's what most meta-analysts are using, something more like the short form than the long one. Here are the things we typically code. We wanted a year, author, title, the journal. So this participant characteristics, really, we now put a description in so that we don't have to ever go back to the study. We actually type in the descriptive pieces, but SES, ethnicity, gender, reading ability, grade are some of the things that we will code. We'll look at, these are general intervention types, or intervention characteristics. We do a lot more than that, but these are the ones that are cross, typically intervention. How long did it last? How many hours? Who delivered it? What was the group? What was the treatment? Where was it given? Was it in a school, a home? Sometimes that matters. What kind of assessment was used? We have a bunch of pieces around assessment, reliability, what text was used, who administered it, what was the training. I mean, we have everything. If your questions, if you're not interested in that, then you don't have to include that. But that's one of the things we're usually interested in. And then, you know, what were the design characteristics? And then what did the effect size look like?
So each of those cells has multiple data information.
Every
that's
word
there.
you see there, every word you see that, yes. These are codes. We actually code, and you can see that from the coding sheet. You can see that 1 is low, 0 is low SES, 1 is high or middle SES. It's broken down this way in this particular meta-analysis because of the analysis that we're going to use is an advanced, that's also stopping me, but it's an advanced methodology that we're using in this next one because I want to include all of the measures. And you can only to keep dependency, you can only choose one outcome for every study. Every study has to have its own. And then you lose a lot because in comprehension, we have a ton of different kinds of, you know, measures that are used in a single study. But it's dependent because the control group is getting, you're double dipping essentially every time you have one of those measures. So you can't do that. And so, but there's a new technique, and I don't have it in here, in which they actually model for that. So it's an HLM nested design where it models that information. So that's probably that up and coming, that's what people are going to move to next. But right now, it would certainly not be necessary for you to do the multi-level modeling for any of these
Sorry,
questions.
Amy. So for the coding form, these are samples of one when you look through each
That's
journal, right?
That's
Like the
one article.
Just one article
That's
because
one
the
article.
detailed one is a lot.
That's one article. But the short form is not as bad, right? The short form is doable, right? And you would have on there the actual codes, like 1 equals this, 0 equals this. So you'd just be putting ones and zeros in your coding form. Either hard copy, some people still like to work on hard copy and then move it to the computer, or you can enter it directly into the your Excel coding sheet. And what I will do here is we have comments up here, or we have this where it tells you exactly, okay, SES. And the reason that low is 0 is because that way I can interpret it when I get the data back. I know which direction. We expect that low is going to be lower, right? So that's why it's easier to interpret. So that's why you'll see it set up in the way that it is. But I only learned that after doing the first one. So it's those little things that you may have to recode your data to make it make sense to you. This is a short form that you could have, and then you just have the codes out to the side or on a separate sheet of paper, I suppose. Next, you get to the heart of meta-analysis. You gotta calculate the effect sizes. If you're choosing a measure, then you just have to need a procedure for choosing that, right? Or you can combine all of them into a single, and there's a procedure for that. There's a calculator where you can combine all of those measures into one and use that for your study. And if you split out standardized versus custom, it's like doing 2 meta-analyses, which is what I did in both of mine. Not exactly on the second one, but in general, I've split them out so that I kind of am doing 2 meta-analyses because I think they're different questions based on the outcome. Like I have to interpret that differently. So you could do that as well. Okay, there are different types, but the only one that I work in usually is the standardized mean difference. There may be, we're actually going to be doing some correlational work coming up in background knowledge on comprehension. Ollie Risley, one of my students, is interested in that, so we are probably moving towards that. So this is real easy because you just take the correlation that's given to you. So actually that's probably easier than what I've been doing. But here there are calculators that will calculate this for you. This right here, you just go to this little effect size calculator and you put in your means and standard deviations and your sample size of each group, and it spits back the effect size for you. So not really difficult there. We're not going to go in depth, but those of you who are interested, you can have the slides. These are the types of analyses nowadays using a random effects meta-regression is typical in these. And here are the programs for that. So SPSS can do it, some of it. but you have to have macros for it. SAS, the same thing. I'm currently using Stata because I like the programs that are being developed in Stata, and it's easy to use. However, it doesn't, the graphics I have trouble with. They're really difficult to find how you change graphics, how you make things look pretty in the code, because it is a coding system. You're putting in the code and then putting in your variables, which isn't difficult to do. It sounds hard, but somebody's already done that. You just need to know where to stick your variable names in, and then it spits back the information at you. But it doesn't, I struggle with the graphs, and graphs are a big part of meta-analysis. So comprehensive meta-analysis does that much better. We have one program here right now, like in one computer that has that in R144. So if you were interested, that's, I'm sure that Dr. Kim will be okay with you coming in and using our comprehensive meta-analysis. I've put together a class proposal. It's at the college level right now. So once that gets going, you all are welcome to sit in on class, and then hopefully we would at some point have a lab where we'd actually have CMA and some of these other statistical programs on there. RevMan is free, but they're not updating it anymore, but it's still very useful. And R is what a lot of people are using now, if you know R. I don't like R. I've been to do workshops. I just need to do it, but I can get everything else I need here, so I haven't learned R.
Do we have Stata? Like, I
You
know we have
don't.
SPSS.
You don't have SPSS?
I do.
Oh, you
So
do?
We do have SPSS.
And you could run most code. I don't know how if it's been updated, and I need to check on that, but I'm sure you can. I'm sure that there are ways to do, because that's what I originally learned in. Stata I bought on my own, because they weren't going to buy it because they said I had SPSS and I didn't need Stata. But I'm like, well, but I need it for Meta because so many people are doing work in Meta, or I need to move to R. And so I just bought it myself.
So do we have SAS? What about SAS? Do we have it?
Some people have SAS, I think, and it's the same. I think that the people that write in SPSS are probably also, doing the SAS macros. When we interpret meta, but we talked about this earlier, some people say 0.4, other people say 0.1. These are the general rules of thumb for that standardized mean difference, which we're doing when we're talking about instruction, or we're talking about quasi or experimental research, 0.2, 0.5, and 0.8. But when Mark Lipsey went through the literature, he found that actually it looks like a small effect size is a 0.15, a medium is 0.45, and a large is 0.90. And this is from him going through all of this is in 1990 though, going through all of the education literature, and he's done multiple fields. And in education, this is what it looked like from the data, instead of just, because Cohen said, these are just rules of thumb, I don't know, and then if you look at, and this is really interesting, you also have to think about development, right? Because if you see reading growth here in grades 1 to 2, 0.97, when you get to grades 11, 12, 0.06. So what do you think's happening there?
They're not learning to read. They're already.
Right, these skills, right? They have a lot to learn here, right? So those effect sizes for those interventions are much higher. So maybe if I see a 1.29, maybe I shouldn't be that excited if I'm in grades 1 to 2, because that's pretty average, right? But if I see it here, that's crazy good, or they lied. Same thing with math. So keeping this, often we'll just go by 0.2, 0.5, and 0.8, but it really has to be contextualized with who you're talking about and the literature that you're in. This is how we assess publication bias, because studies that didn't reach significance, why didn't they reach significance? It's likely they had a small sample, right? So that bias is not publishing. They're being denied publication, or they don't even try for publication because they didn't get statistical significance. So we run this, we run all of these, actually. I will usually run at least 2, if not 3 of these. but this is the figure we typically look at, which is called a funnel plot, and we look for this space over here in the left hand side. This would tell us that there is small sample bias or publication bias present. And it doesn't mean that it is publication bias, but it makes us go, oh, were our searches enough? Did we really find everything that's out there? Or, was the stuff not reported? And then we have to take that into account when we're talking about where does that effect size actually lie? Like, if these studies did exist, would it be a 0.4 or would it be a 0.2? And that's what we have to report on that. Those standards that I was talking about, we have a lot of information now on standards. The Campbell collaboration are the people that do systematic reviews and meta-analysis in education. So if you want to find out what's been done in education, there are two places, What Works Clearinghouse and Campbell Collaboration, where you can find what works, right? It's Cochrane, the Cochrane organization. The Cochrane Collaboration is the place if you have a medical issue. So if you want to know if a medical procedure is the right way to go, there's probably a meta-analysis that's been done through the Cochrane Collaboration. My doctors hate me. So I look at it and I'm like, okay. And then I can tell, they're like, oh, and sometimes they'll go pull it. And they're like, I didn't know about that research. Yeah, it just came out. So I think that's useful. This is just an example of what you would be reporting. So here are the general and methodological characteristics. I think this is I don't know which study this one was. I want to say it's vocabulary. Looks like vocabulary. So here's all the data we took. Here's just the descriptive data, which I think is actually really useful if I'm looking at something, because I want to know how many times, maybe this was inference. Was it inference? So I want to know, here, they used a business as usual control, but here they used business as usual, but they had this material, they actually did something with them here. Let's do something more interesting than that. Measure and participant characteristics. So what was the format? Oh, this is the inference, yes. General outcomes, inference outcomes, literal outcomes. Was it open-ended or recall? Was it multiple choice? Was it mixed format? So now I know what the literature looks like and what it's based on. These effect sizes now have some kind of context to tell me what they mean. Standardized custom measures, listening versus reading. Did they have reliability or not, those measures? Who were the kids involved? So now I know which studies had what types of samples. This is another way that I display that data, but by each, this is by study. Oh, and I went over time. Lost it. So this just tells you exactly what the inference effect size was, if they had one, who was how many in the treatment, the control, what was the control group, what was the grade. This gives you by study. So now, if I'm a doc student or anybody writing a lit review, I can go right across and get all of the data that if it gives it in a way that's not present elsewhere, and tells you where the holes are, because you can see that textual instruction, there's not a whole lot there, right? So for some of these types of interventions, I can know what's been done and what needs to be studied next. We have to do forest plot, but I won't go through that, but I like I think we need to start doing it in an interpretive dance to present our data. But what you see here is just each study you have here, and then the dots represent really sample size, and then the standard error also is in the bars there. And we can see these were the kids that were less skilled, and these are standardized measures, custom measures, and here are kids with learning disabilities. So you can see the differences then visually, that these kids are different. These studies were different than the others. These are the kinds of outcomes that you would put out. We know that in inference, for instance, with the 25 inference studies, that we see a 0.58 effect size for general measures, 0.68 for inferential, and a 0.28 we didn't teach. So I excluded all things that were literal in nature. These are only inference studies. But if you focus on for inference, you get literal for free, which is kind of cool. And so all of these are statistically different than 0. That's how we do this in meta-analysis to know that that effect size is statistically different than 0. But what was interesting is when we broke up the skilled, this was the moderator analysis. When we looked at the skilled versus the less skilled readers, the inference kids, if you're a good reader, the inference helped you. It didn't really help you on your literal information. You were already getting that fine. If you're less skilled, look at what happens to your literal understanding when you engage in inferential activities. That to me was a finding I did not expect and had to try to understand and write the paper around, and I made some suggestions that people are throwing around now, whether they think that those are on target or not. So I think that's interesting. So is that the case that these kids need to do more inferential? Because when I was a SPED teacher, it was let's get through the 5 first items, which are always literal, and then the hard questions, the evaluative, the inference questions. We might get to those, but usually not. And if we did, I usually gave them the answers or moved them through pretty quickly. It could be I was doing it totally wrong and should have only been doing the inference, and they would have gotten the literal for free. Don't know. That's the grant that I'm working on now to answer that question. But it looks from this data like it could be. Anyway, they usually come with context. This is what the other outcomes look like when you give them. These are just potential outlets. RER is my next goal. I don't think I'm getting an RER, but the feedback should be good. It's right now, I think, an 8.0 impact factor or something crazy. So we will see, but I mean, why not go for that one and like get good feedback and then go to one of the others. Here are resources and books. There are more back here. If you ever need to know, like, I'm curious about, I probably got a book on it for meta-analysis. I've got a great one I'm halfway through right now. Top mistakes or 10 mistakes in meta-analysis by Borenstein. So like it's very interesting. Like for instance, Forest was written F-O-R-E-S-T to begin with, but then somebody at a conference started doing F-O-R-R-E-S-T, and lots of people just took up. So you see it both ways now. So it's like these different kinds of mistakes I had no idea about. Here are instructional videos, so you can really learn how to do meta-analysis on your own. There are suites of instructional videos on it. And if you guys have any questions or you want to do a meta, you let us know. We're your people.
In-house.
Ooh, this is amazing.
Sorry, this is a little overwhelming, yeah. Sorry. But it's like anyone is capable, as long as you're a hard worker and you can keep track of data, anyone is capable of this work, So, and it answers, I think, important questions like that we have about instruction and what works.
Amy, earlier you mentioned that, some of the meta-analysis actually go down all the way to like 25 to 30, right, articles?
Oh, yeah.
So is it because...
15 is the usually where they start saying you probably shouldn't go below.
I mean, how do they go down to that? Is it because a search becomes very narrow, the exclusion criteria becomes
and there's so much. So
more?
when you start actually going through literature, you'll see that most of the studies are not primary. They're secondary. So they're just reviews about the literature, or they're teacher pieces, or they're really translation of research to practice often, or reviews. They're not typically actual primary research. And our students are always amazed by that when they do their first systematic review and they find, I'm getting rid of everything. Yeah. So there's very little out there actually.
I know we're over time.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
No, it's not your fault. And this is a real basic question, so I'll just apologize up front. But how do you know if your research question is for meta-analysis? So you got to search the data you search to see if your question's been answered.
That's right. If someone's done one previously, but also for me it's got to be, because it's like what works. Anytime you're asking a what works question, I think that if there are enough studies in that area, I think it automatically gets you there. Other questions, it may not be, but could be turned into, if you frame it I think most things you can probably frame if enough studies have been done in that area. Yeah. Good question.